83 missed calls, 41 texts, all from my family, all in less than 12 hours. I remember staring at my phone in the dim light of my apartment kitchen, the screen glowing like it was trying to confess something on their behalf. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I thought they would shake. I thought I would feel something dramatic, something that matched the numbers. I didn't, just kind of quiet. The kind that comes after something breaks clean through the center of your life. If you have ever been told in front of people who are supposed to love you that you don't belong, then you already know how this story ends. If not, stay with me. I promise you, it gets worse before it gets honest. 3 days earlier, I was standing in my parents' dining room in Lincoln Park, Chicago, holding a bottle of wine I had picked up from a place on Clark Street. A mid-range Cabernet, nothing flashy but decent. I remember thinking it was the right choice. Safe. Neutral. That was before I realized I had already been written out of the evening. There were close to 80 people in the house. Cousins I hadn't seen in years. Neighbors who always showed up for things like this. People from my dad's business circle, my mom's friends from church, even a few faces I didn't recognize at all. The air smelled like roasted meat and something sweet, maybe cinnamon. Laughter filled the rooms, layered and constant like white noise you couldn't turn off. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, just inside the doorway, watching. No one noticed. That should have been my first clue. I closed the door behind me and walked in, placing the wine on the kitchen counter next to 3 other bottles that looked a lot more expensive than mine. Someone had already opened them. Glasses were half full, abandoned in clusters like conversations that had moved on without warning. My mom was near the island, laughing at something my aunt had said. Her hand rested lightly on my cousin's arm, that familiar gesture she used when she wanted to look warm and connected. She glanced in my direction, just a flick of her eyes. Then she looked away. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so consistent. At 10, I learned not to interrupt. At 16, I learned not to expect. At 28, I was still standing in doorways, waiting to be acknowledged in my own family's house. I picked up a glass, poured myself a small amount of wine, and moved into the living room. My dad was holding court near the fireplace, telling one of his stories about how he built his company from nothing. He used that word a lot. Nothing, as if it gave him ownership over the concept. Daniel stood beside him, relaxed, confident, nodding at the right moments. Of course he was. Daniel always knew when to nod. I caught a piece of the conversation as I passed. Something about expansion, about future plans, about how the next generation would carry things forward. My dad placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, firm, proud. There it was, the image, the legacy. I took a sip of wine and leaned against the wall, just outside the circle, close enough to hear, not close enough to be included. Someone asked about me. I heard my name. It floated through the room, light, almost accidental. My dad didn't hesitate. He never did. He said something about how I was still figuring things out. A little laugh followed, not cruel, not openly, just enough to signal dismissal. I felt it land. He didn't have to say more. The room understood. I remember thinking with a kind of detached clarity that this was a pattern, not a moment. A pattern. At 10, I was the sensitive one. At 16, I was the difficult one. At 23, I was the one who made choices they didn't agree with. Now I was the one who contributed nothing. 3 labels, 3 lies. 3 times I should have known better. I pushed myself off the wall and walked into the dining room. The long table was already set, plates arranged perfectly, glasses aligned like someone had measured the distance between each one. My mom cared about details like that. Presentation mattered, even if the truth didn't. I took a seat near the end, not assigned, just available. People began to settle in. Chairs scraped lightly against the hardwood floor. Conversations overlapped, then quieted as dishes were passed around. Someone made a toast. Something about family, about gratitude, about how lucky we all were to be together. I almost choked on that. Halfway through dinner, the conversation shifted again. It always did. Someone brought up Daniel's recent promotion. Applause followed. Genuine, enthusiastic. He smiled, modest in that practiced way that made people like him even more. My dad stood up slightly, lifting his glass. He talked about hard work, about discipline, about what it meant to build something that lasted. Then he turned to Daniel and said he was proud of him, that he had proven himself, that he had earned his place. Earned. The word hung there. And then, without even looking at me, he added something else. Something about how not everyone in this family understood responsibility. A few people laughed. Nervous, uncertain. I felt every eye flick in my direction, then away just as quickly. My mom set her fork down and leaned back slightly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She said it more clearly, more directly. She said some people just drift through life, that they take without giving back, that they expect to belong without ever earning it. Then she looked straight at me and said I didn't belong here, just like that, calm, measured, as if she were stating a fact about the weather. The room went still. No one corrected her. No one laughed this time. No one said my name. Silence filled the space where I used to exist. I remember the sound of my own breathing. Slow, even, controlled. I remember noticing the way my hands rested on the table, how they didn't move. I should have felt something explosive. Anger, humiliation, tears. Instead, I felt something colder, clearer, like a line had finally been drawn, not by me, but for me. I nodded once, not to agree, just to acknowledge that I had heard her. Then I stood up. No speech, no scene, no attempt to defend myself. I pushed my chair in, quietly, the way I had been taught when I was a child, and walked out of the room. I heard someone say my name behind me. Soft. Too late. I didn't turn around. The hallway felt longer than I remembered. The front door heavier. I opened it, stepped outside, and closed it behind me with a soft click. The night air hit my face, cool and steady. Chicago in late fall, that sharp edge in the wind that reminds you winter is coming whether you are ready or not. I walked to my car, my heels clicking against the pavement, each step sounding louder than it should have. Inside, it was quiet. I sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. I almost laughed again. Of all the things I expected from that dinner, being erased wasn't on the list, but looking back, it should have been. The signs had been there, not subtle, not hidden, just ignored. I reached into my bag more out of habit than intention, and my fingers brushed against something solid. A small wooden box. I had forgotten it was there. My grandma had given it to me months ago, not long before she passed. She had pressed it into my hands with that quiet insistence she had, the kind that didn't invite questions. She told me to keep it safe. She told me I would know when to open it. I hadn't, not until that moment. I pulled it out and set it on my lap. The wood was smooth, worn slightly at the edges, familiar, grounding. For the first time that night, my hands hesitated, not because I was afraid, because something in me already understood that whatever was inside that box was going to change everything. I exhaled slowly, my breath fogging the windshield just slightly, and rested my fingers on the lid. Then I opened it. Inside the box was a small flash drive, matte black, no label, no brand, just weight. And beneath it, a folded piece of paper in my grandma's handwriting. My name. Nothing else on the outside. I unfolded it slowly, the paper soft at the creases like it had been opened and closed more than once before it ever reached me. The first line stopped me, not because it was dramatic, because it was precise. She wrote that if I was reading this, then they had already done what she warned me about. They had erased me. My throat tightened, just slightly, not enough to hurt, just enough to notice. There was a number written below. A lawyer. And one sentence I read twice, then a third time, just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. She wrote that everything they thought belonged to them was never theirs to begin with, and that I was the only one who could prove it. I sat there with the note still in my hand, reading that last line again like it might rearrange itself into something less precise. It didn't. Everything they thought belonged to them was never theirs to begin with, and I was the only one who could prove it. I let out a slow breath and leaned back against the seat. Outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across my windshield before disappearing down the street. The world was moving. Normal. Mine had shifted, quietly but completely. I picked up the flash drive and turned it over between my fingers. It was lighter than I expected. That always feels wrong, doesn't it? When something that could change your life weighs almost nothing. There was nothing else in the box. No instructions, no explanation, just the number on the note and that sentence sitting in my chest like a piece of glass. I reached for my phone. 83 missed calls, 41 texts. I didn't open any of them. Instead, I dialed the number my grandma had written down. It rang twice. A man answered, voice calm, measured, the kind of tone that doesn't waste words. I said my name. There was a pause. Not long, just enough to tell me he already knew who I was. He asked if I was somewhere private. I looked around my car, the empty street, the soft glow of porch lights across the block. I said yes. Another pause. Then he said that he had been expecting my call. I almost laughed at that. Of course he had. Apparently everyone knew something except me. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask what had happened. He asked one thing. He asked if my parents had formally or publicly rejected me. The words were clinical. Formal. Publicly rejected. I thought about the dining room, about 80 people, about my mom's voice, calm and certain. I said yes. He exhaled slowly. Not surprised, not shocked, just confirming a box had been checked. He said that meant the condition had been met. Condition. Not betrayal, not conflict. A condition. Something in me went very still. I asked him what he was talking about. He told me his name was Gregory Hale and that he had been my grandma's attorney for over 20 years. That he had helped her structure something very specific. Something that would only come into effect under certain circumstances. And then he said something that made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. He said those circumstances had just occurred. I stared out at the street, watching a stray leaf roll across the pavement, caught in a small gust of wind. I asked him what was on the flash drive. He told me to go somewhere safe, somewhere I could sit down, somewhere I wouldn't be interrupted. I almost told him I was already sitting down, already alone, already interrupted in every way that mattered, but I didn't. I started the car instead. The drive back to my apartment in River North took about 15 minutes. I don't remember most of it, just the rhythm of traffic lights, the hum of the engine, the way my hands stayed steady on the wheel even though my thoughts weren't. I kept thinking about that word, condition. Like my entire place in that family had been a clause in a contract I didn't know existed. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me out of habit. Not fear, just routine. I set my bag on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and stood there for a second, looking at my own space. Clean, quiet, mine. I moved to the kitchen table and sat down. The overhead light was a little too bright, but I didn't bother dimming it. I needed to see clearly. I placed the flash drive in front of me. Then I opened my laptop. It took a few seconds to boot up. Longer than usual, or maybe it just felt that way. I tapped my fingers lightly against the table, a small, controlled rhythm that matched the way my mind was trying to organize itself. When the screen finally settled, I inserted the drive. One folder appeared, no title, just a date. I clicked it. There was a single video file. My chest tightened. Not with fear exactly, but with recognition. I already knew what this was. I opened it. The screen flickered for a moment, then steadied. My grandma sat in a chair I recognized immediately. The one by the window in her living room. The one she used to sit in every afternoon with a book she rarely finished. The light behind her was soft, late afternoon, the kind that made everything look warmer than it actually was. She looked older than I remembered, smaller, but her eyes were the same. Sharp, focused. She looked directly into the camera, into me. She said my name. And just like that, I was 10 years old again, standing in her kitchen while she showed me how to measure flour without packing it down. Careful. Precise. Always paying attention to the small things that other people overlook. She didn't smile. That was my first clue. This wasn't a casual message. She said that if I was watching this, then something had already happened. Something she had prepared for but hoped would never come. She said I had been removed. Not left out, not overlooked, removed. I felt that word settled differently than the others had. More deliberate, more final. She continued, her voice steady, controlled in that same way mine had become over the years. She said there were things about my family that I had never been told. Not because they forgot, not because they didn't matter, but because someone had decided it was better if I didn't know. I leaned forward slightly, my elbows resting on the table, my eyes fixed on the screen. She said something then that made my breath catch just a fraction. She said I was not who they told me I was. I sat back slowly, the chair creaking softly under my weight. Not who they told me I was. I replayed the sentence in my head, turning it over the same way I had with the flash drive. I should have felt panic, confusion. Instead, I felt something colder, curiosity. She didn't explain it right away. She talked about patterns instead, about how people build stories around themselves, around their families, around their sense of control. How those stories can become more important than the truth. She said my dad had always cared about legacy, about image, about continuity. She said my mom had always cared about stability, about keeping things looking the way they were supposed to look. I almost smiled at that. It was accurate, uncomfortably so. Then she said something that shifted everything again. She said there had been a decision made a long time ago, one that involved me, one that involved what I represented. She didn't say what that decision was, not yet. She said Gregory would explain the rest. Of course he would. She looked at the camera for a long second, her expression softening just slightly. She said she was sorry, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that asked for forgiveness, just a statement. Then the video ended. The screen went black. I sat there, staring at my own reflection for a moment. The overhead light behind me made my face look sharper, more defined. Older, maybe? Or just more aware. I reached for my phone again. Gregory answered on the first ring this time. I told him I had watched it. He didn't ask what I thought. He didn't ask how I felt. He asked if I understood that what I was dealing with was not a family disagreement. I said I was starting to. He said this had been structured years ago, carefully, legally. He said my grandma had anticipated resistance, denial, possibly even attempts to discredit or exclude me if certain information ever became relevant. So she had built something that would activate if I was formally removed. There was that word again, activate. Like I wasn't just a person in this situation, like I was a trigger. I asked him what exactly had been activated. There was a brief pause. Then he said something that made the room feel smaller. He said a series of legal protections and financial controls had just shifted. Shifted. I closed my eyes for a second just to steady myself. This wasn't about feelings. This was infrastructure. I asked him what that meant for me. He said it meant I needed to come see him in person, that there were documents I needed to review, decisions I would need to make, and timelines that had already begun. Timelines. Of course there were timelines. I looked around my apartment again, at the clean counters, the quiet corners, the life I had built that had nothing to do with them. Then I thought about the dining room, about the silence, about my mom's voice. You don't belong here. I opened my eyes. I asked him when he wanted me there. He said as soon as possible. I checked the time on the stove. Late, but not too late to start something I couldn't undo. I told him I would be there in the morning. He gave me the address. Downtown, not far. When I hung up, the apartment felt different, not smaller, not bigger, just defined. Like lines had been drawn I couldn't pretend not to see anymore. I closed my laptop slowly, the screen going dark again, my reflection disappearing with it. For a moment, I just sat there, hands resting on the table, listening to the quiet. Then I reached for the flash drive and slipped it back into the box. Not because I was done with it, because I understood, finally, that it wasn't the beginning. It was evidence, and I hadn't even seen the rest of it yet. I woke up before my alarm, which almost never happens. For a second, I didn't move. Just lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for my brain to catch up to where my body already was. Then it did. The box. The video. The word activate. I sat up slowly, the sheets sliding off my lap. The morning light coming in through the window in that soft gray way Chicago mornings tend to have this time of year. My phone was on the nightstand. I reached for it out of habit. 89 missed calls now, 53 texts. They were still trying. I didn't open any of them. Instead, I got up, showered, dressed in something simple. Black slacks, a neutral blouse, a coat that made me feel put together even if I wasn't. I tied my hair back, not because I needed to, but because I wanted everything controlled. Control felt important. By the time I stepped outside, the city was already awake. Traffic moving steadily down LaSalle. People with coffee cups in hand, heads down, focused on their own lives. I wondered briefly what it would feel like to be one of them. just moving through the day without realizing that something fundamental had shifted under their feet. Then I got into my car and drove downtown. Gregory's office was in a building I had passed 100 times and never noticed. Tall, glass, quiet in that expensive way that doesn't need to announce itself. Inside, everything was muted. Soft lighting, polished floors, a receptionist who looked up as soon as I walked in like she had been expecting me. She said my name before I introduced myself. Of course she did. She asked me to have a seat. I didn't sit. I stood there for a moment, looking around, taking in the kind of place where decisions get made that other people feel years later. After a minute, a door opened down the hallway. Gregory stepped out. He was older than I expected, late 60s, maybe early 70s. Gray hair, sharp eyes, posture that suggested he had spent his entire life in rooms like this. He looked at me for a second, not in a way that felt intrusive, more like he was confirming something. Then he nodded once and gestured for me to follow him. His office was large, but not showy. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with binders more than books. A desk that was clean, almost too clean, like nothing stayed on it longer than necessary. He motioned toward a chair across from him. This time, I sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at me in a way that felt direct but not unkind. He said he was sorry for the circumstances. Not sorry in a comforting way, sorry in a factual way. I nodded. Then I told him I didn't need comfort. I needed clarity. Something in his expression shifted, just slightly. Approval, maybe. He reached for a folder on his desk. Thick. Organized. Tabs along the side. He turned it so it faced me and opened it slowly. Inside were documents, not copies, originals. He said what I was about to see had been put together over a long period of time, carefully, intentionally. He said my grandma had been very specific about how and when I would receive this information. Then he said something that settled into me in a way I couldn't ignore. He said none of this was accidental. I leaned forward slightly. He began with trust. He explained that my grandma had established the private trust years ago, not recently, not as part of her estate planning near the end. Years ago. He said the structure was unusual, not illegal, not questionable, just precise. The trust had a primary beneficiary. Me. I didn't react right away, I just listened. He said there were secondary beneficiaries, conditional ones. But the core control of the trust, the decision-making authority, the access to certain assets, all of it centered on me. I thought about the dining room again, about my dad's voice, about the word earned. It didn't match. I asked him why I had never been told. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned a few pages in the folder and slid a document toward me. My name was on it. So was Daniel's, but not in the way I expected. I scanned the page quickly, my eyes catching phrases, dates, legal language that I understood just enough of to follow the structure. There was a narrative built into the document, a public-facing version of the trust that positioned Daniel as the central successor. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I looked up at Gregory. He said that version was never the operative one. It was the visible one, the one people were meant to see. I almost smiled, not because it was funny, because it was familiar. A story, carefully constructed, maintained over time, repeated until it became truth. I asked him if my parents knew. He didn't hesitate. He said yes. The word landed harder than anything else so far. Not confusion, not misunderstanding, knowledge. He reached for another section of the folder and opened it. These documents were older. Hospital records, birth records, amendments. I felt my posture change without meaning to, my shoulders straightening, my focus narrowing. He said there were details about my early life that had been documented, reviewed, and then managed. I read the first page, then the second. The words blurred for a moment, not because I couldn't understand them, but because my brain was trying to place them somewhere that made sense. Dates, locations, names. None of them matched the version of my life I had been told. I looked up again, slower this time. He didn't look away. He said the specifics would take time to process, and that he would walk me through them. But the core truth was simple. The narrative I had been raised with was not accurate, not slightly off, fundamentally wrong. I sat back in the chair, the leather cool against my back. For a second, I thought about being a child again, about sitting at the kitchen table while my mom explained things to me in a way that always felt just a little incomplete, about how certain questions were redirected instead of answered, about how Daniel was always included in conversations about the future, and I wasn't. At 10, I noticed it. At 16, I questioned it. At 23, I stopped asking. Because every time I did, the response was the same. You are overthinking. You are too sensitive. You don't understand how things work. I looked down at the documents again. Turns out, I understood exactly how things worked. I just didn't know I was the thing being managed. Gregory spoke again, pulling me back to the present. He said my parents had been given access to this information years ago. Not all of it at once, but enough. Enough to understand the structure. Enough to understand where I stood. Enough to make decisions based on that knowledge. I felt something shift again. Not shock this time, not even anger. Recognition. This wasn't about being overlooked. It wasn't about favoritism. It wasn't about personality differences or misunderstandings. It was intentional, deliberate. I wasn't left out. I was removed. The word from the video came back, clearer now, sharper. Removed. I closed the folder slowly, my hands resting on top of it for a second longer than necessary. Then I looked at Gregory. I asked him what exactly had been activated when they said those words to me. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for another folder. Thinner this time. More direct. He placed it in front of me but didn't open it. He said this was where things stopped being theoretical. This was where consequences began. I felt my breath slow, my focus narrowing even further. I placed my hand on the edge of the folder. And for the first time since dinner, since the box, since the video, I felt something that wasn't cold, not anger, not fear, something closer to clarity. I opened it. I closed the folder slowly, my hand still resting on the page, like if I let go too quickly, something inside it might disappear. Gregory didn't rush me. He just watched, patient in that way that comes from having seen people reach this exact point before. I asked him one question. I asked if the verification had already been done. He nodded. Not a dramatic nod. Just a simple confirmation. He said it had been completed years ago when the trust was first established. Verified, documented, sealed, there it was. No uncertainty, no maybe. This wasn't something that needed to be proven anymore. It already had been. I let that settle for a second, then another. Then I asked what had actually happened 3 nights ago, from his perspective, not emotionally, structurally. He leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands again. He said the trust contained a clause tied to formal rejection. Public, verifiable, witnessed. Not private arguments, not strained relationships. A clear statement of exclusion. Once that condition was met, a sequence of actions was triggered automatically. Not manually, automatically. I almost smiled at that. Of course it was automated. My grandma never left anything open to interpretation. He reached for a document on the side of his desk, separate from the folders, something that had already been prepared. He said that at exactly 9:14 in the evening, 3 nights ago, a notification had been logged. Not from me. From a monitoring mechanism tied to the trust. I didn't ask how. I didn't need to. He continued. At 9:17 in the evening, confirmation protocols were initiated. At 9:22, the condition was verified. At 9:25, the system executed. Executed. I let out a quiet breath through my nose. This wasn't emotional. This was precise. He slid the document toward me. I read it quickly, my eyes moving faster now, my mind keeping pace. A series of notifications had been sent out. To financial institutions, to legal representatives, to specific individuals listed as secondary stakeholders, and to my family. I looked up at him. He said the emails would have gone out within minutes of the trigger being confirmed. I thought about the dining room again. The moment I stood up. The silence. The doors closing behind me. While I was walking to my car, something else had already started moving. Quietly, efficiently. I asked him what exactly those emails said. He hesitated for the first time. Not because he didn't know. Because he knew I was about to understand the scale of it. He said they were formal notices of structural change. Control shifts. Asset protections. Temporary freezes on certain accounts and decision-making authorities. Not everything, just enough. Just enough to make it impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed on the desk between us. Then again, I didn't look at it. I already knew. Gregory didn't either. He just let it vibrate until it stopped. Then it started again. The third time it started, I reached for it without thinking. Not because I was ready, because my hands moved before I could stop them. My mom's name is on the screen. I answered. I don't know why. Maybe because some part of me still expected something different. Some version of her I had been waiting for without realizing it. Her voice came through immediately, quieter than I expected, not controlled, not strategic, just tired. She said my name the way she used to when I was small, before the label started. Before I became the sensitive one, the difficult one, the one who didn't understand how things worked. Just my name. And something in my chest pulled tight. She didn't ask about the emails. She didn't mention Gregory or the trusts or the accounts that were already moving without her permission. She said she remembered the night I was born. I almost hung up, but I didn't. She said it had been raining, that my dad had been stuck in a meeting he couldn't leave, that she had driven herself to the hospital and called her mother from the waiting room, and that when I finally arrived, she had held me for an hour before anyone else came. She said I had the quietest cry she had ever heard. She said she remembered thinking I already knew something. Even then, I seemed to understand something she didn't. I sat very still. Gregory hadn't moved across the desk. My phone felt heavier than it should have. She said she didn't expect me to understand the decisions they had made, but she wanted me to know that nothing had ever come from not caring. That was the part that did it, not caring. I closed my eyes, because that was exactly it. Not cruelty, not malice, something worse in its own way. Decisions made about my life by people who believed, genuinely believed. They were acting out of something that looked like love. And for a second, I just wanted to believe her. I wanted the version of this that ended with her voice still sounding like that, tired and honest and almost sorry. I wanted to say something that would let us both step back from the edge of what was already in motion. I had the words. They were right there, 3 sentences. That's all it would have taken. The phone was warm against my palm. The office was quiet. Gregory had turned slightly toward the window, giving me something that felt like privacy. And in that second, it would have been so easy to let it go. All of it. The folders. The signatures are still pending. The structure my grandmother had built for exactly this moment. I could have said, "Let me call you back." I didn't. Not because I wasn't tempted. Because I heard something underneath her voice that I had always heard and always chosen to ignore. The absence of an apology. Not forgotten. Not withheld by accident. Simply not there. She had told me a story about the night I was born. She had not said she was wrong. I exhaled slowly. Then I said, "I know." 2 words, nothing else. And I ended the call. I picked it up slowly. The screen lit up with notifications stacked on top of each other. Family group chat. Messages coming in faster than I could read them. I opened it. The first thing I saw was confusion. What is this? Did anyone else get that email? Call me right now? This has to be a mistake. Then it shifted. Who authorized this? Why is my access restricted? What do you mean pending review? My dad's name appeared next. Short messages. Direct. Call me now. My mom followed. Her tone was different. Softer. Controlled. We need to talk. There must be some misunderstanding. I almost laughed. There it was. The first attempt to reshape the narrative. I scrolled further. Extended family members. People who had been at the dinner. People who hadn't spoken to me in years. Some were confused. Some were angry. Some were already choosing sides without having any real information. Then the video calls started. Group calls. Multiple at once. I could see the icons lighting up, people trying to pull each other in, trying to figure out what had just happened. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I locked my phone and set it face down on the desk. Gregory watched me for a moment. He said this was the first wave. Shock, confusion, denial. He said it would escalate. Of course it would. I nodded once. Then I asked him what had been frozen. He opened another section of the folder, this one more technical. He pointed to specific entries. Access to certain accounts tied to the trust. Decision-making authority within a family-controlled entity. Temporary holds on transfers that required dual authorization. I followed along, understanding enough to see the pattern. This wasn't a shutdown, it was pressure. Targeted. Strategic. Just enough to force attention. My phone buzzed again. This time, I picked it up. Daniel. His name on the screen felt different now. Not familiar, not safe, just another variable. I let it ring once, twice, then I answered. I didn't say hello. Neither did he. For a second, all I could hear was his breathing, slightly uneven. Not panicked, but not controlled either. Then he spoke. He asked me what I had done. Straight to it. No pretense. I leaned back in the chair, my gaze drifting to the window behind Gregory, the city moving beyond the glass like none of this existed. I said nothing. Daniel exhaled sharply. He said accounts were locked. That decisions he was supposed to finalize that morning had been blocked. That people were asking questions he couldn't answer. I still said nothing. He paused, then his tone shifted slightly. Less accusation, more calculation. He asked if this had something to do with what happened at dinner. I almost smiled. Of all the connections he could make, that one was the most obvious. And still, he phrased it like a question. I let the silence stretch just a little longer. Then I said one thing. I said things had already been in place long before dinner. Another pause. Longer this time. I could almost hear him thinking, trying to fit that into whatever understanding he had of the situation. He asked what that meant. I didn't explain. Not because I couldn't, because I wasn't going to do that work for him. I told him he should check his email again, carefully. Then I hung up. I set the phone back on the desk and looked at Gregory. He didn't ask what Daniel had said. He didn't need to. He had seen this before. The moment when private dynamics become public consequences. The moment when control starts to shift, not emotionally, but structurally. I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction. Not yet. Something more measured. Like a system that had been running in the background for years had finally come online. The family I grew up in had always operated on unspoken rules. Expectations that were never written down but always enforced. This was different. This was written, documented, executed. I reached for my phone again and glanced at the screen. More messages, more calls. The noise was getting louder. And for the first time, it wasn't something I had to manage. It was something they had to face. I looked back at the folder in front of me, at the documents that had been sitting quietly for years, waiting for a moment that no one believed would actually happen. Then I looked at Gregory. I asked him what came next. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed the folder gently, aligning the edges with a precision that felt deliberate. Then he looked at me and said the next part depended on how far I was willing to go. My phone vibrated again, harder this time, like it had something urgent to say and no patience left. I glanced at the screen. It wasn't just Daniel anymore. My dad. Calling. Again. And again. I let it ring the first time. Then the second. By the third, I answered. Not because I wanted to. Because I needed to hear what he would say when control wasn't his anymore. His voice came through sharp, louder than it needed to be. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask what was happening. He demanded to know what I had done. I leaned back slightly, the chair steady beneath me, my voice even when I finally spoke. I said I hadn't done anything. That seemed to make him angrier. He said accounts had been restricted, decisions blocked, people from his firm calling him nonstop asking for clarification he couldn't give. He said it was embarrassing. Embarrassing. That was the word he chose. Not wrong, not unfair. Embarrassing. I almost laughed. Not from humor, from the absurdity of it. Of all the consequences, that was the one that mattered most to him. His voice dropped slightly, not calmer, just more controlled. He asked if I understood what I was risking. I looked at Gregory for a second, then back at nothing in particular. I said I was starting to understand exactly what had been risked long before I knew about it. There was a pause on the line. Then he said something that shifted the tone again. He said this could be fixed, that we could handle it privately, that I didn't need to make a scene. I let that sit for a moment. A scene. 80 people in a dining room. My mom's voice. The silence that followed. That wasn't a scene, but this was. I asked him what exactly he thought needed fixing. Another pause. Longer. Then my mom's voice came through, softer, closer to the phone. She must have been right next to him. She said we needed to talk. That things had been taken out of context. That emotions had been high. I closed my eyes for a second, just to keep my expression neutral even though they couldn't see it. Out of context. I remembered the way she looked at me when she said it. Clear, direct, certain. There had been no confusion in that moment. I opened my eyes again. I told her context wasn't the issue. Then I ended the call. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just done. My phone lit up again almost immediately. Messages stacking faster now. A new thread appeared, not just family, extended family. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly had opinions. Some were subtle, asking what was going on, pretending concern. Others weren't. One message caught my eye. A cousin, someone who had been at the dinner. She said my behavior was unnecessary. That family matters should stay within the family, that I was making things worse. I stared at that for a second. Making things worse? I typed a response, then deleted it. Not because I didn't have anything to say, because I didn't need to say it. The system already had. Gregory watched me quietly, then reached for a tablet on his desk. He turned it toward me, a list of updates. Real time. Notifications from institutions confirming receipt of the trust activation. Acknowledgements. Compliance confirmations. Then one line stood out. A request for review had been denied. I looked closer. The request had come from my dad's office. He had already tried to override it. Of course he had. Gregory said attempts like that were expected. He said the structure had been designed to withstand them. I felt something shift again, deeper this time. Not just clarity, validation. For years I had been told I didn't understand how things worked, that I was outside of it, that I didn't belong in those conversations. And now, the system they relied on was operating without them. I leaned back in the chair, my gaze steady. The noise on my phone kept building. Calls, messages, notifications. The family wasn't just reacting anymore. They were scrambling. And for the first time, the story they had been telling for years was starting to fall apart. Gregory didn't say anything for a while after that. He let the silence sit between us, not awkward, just intentional, like he knew I needed a second to catch up to where everything had just gone. I appreciated that. Most people rush in at that point, fill the space, try to soften things. He didn't. He reached for another section of the folder instead, thicker than the last, and turned it toward me. He said this was where the pattern became visible, not just what happened, how it happened. I leaned forward again, my focus narrowing naturally now. No hesitation this time. The first page was a timeline, clean, structured. Dates lined up in a way that made it easy to follow, almost like someone had built it specifically for me to understand without having to ask questions. I started reading from the top. Early entries, my childhood, education decisions, financial allocations tied to both me and Daniel. At first glance, everything looked normal, balanced even. Then I kept going. That was when the shifts started. Small at first, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Opportunities redirected, resources reallocated, decisions made in rooms I was never invited into. I slowed down, my finger tracing one line after another, connecting pieces that had never made sense before. There it was. At 12, a decision about a private academic program that Daniel was enrolled in. I had asked about it back then. I remember that clearly. I had been told it wasn't the right fit for me. According to this, it had been approved for both of us. Only one of us was enrolled. At 16, a financial account set up in Daniel's name, structured to support long-term investment exposure. I had been given a smaller account, framed as a learning tool. According to this, the original plan had been identical allocations. Only one of us received it. I sat back slightly, my eyes still on the page, but my mind moving through years of small moments that had never quite added up. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't oversight. This was adjustment. Systematic. Deliberate. I kept reading. College planning. Career introductions. Networking opportunities. Every step of the way, there had been a version of reality presented to me, and a different version executed behind the scenes. The gap between those two versions wasn't random. It was controlled. I looked up at Gregory. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded slightly, like he could see exactly where I was in the process. I asked him when this started. He flipped back a few pages, then tapped a date. I recognized the year immediately. I was 10. I didn't react right away. I just stared at the number, letting it sit there, letting it settle into everything I thought I remembered about that time. 10. The age when things started to feel different, not obviously wrong, just slightly off. The age when my grandma started paying closer attention to me. When she would ask questions no one else asked. When she would watch my parents in a way I didn't understand at the time. I remember one afternoon in her kitchen, she had been teaching me how to measure flour, making me level it off carefully with the back of a knife. Precision matters, she said. I didn't know what she meant back then. Now I did. I looked back at the timeline. From that point forward, the adjustments became more consistent, not aggressive, not obvious, just enough to guide things in a specific direction, toward Daniel, away from me. I exhaled slowly, my hands resting flat on the desk now, grounding myself in the present instead of drifting into the past. I asked Gregory why. He didn't answer with speculation. He answered with documentation. He turned to another section. Correspondence. Internal notes. Not emotional language. Strategic language. Words like positioning, alignment, risk management. I felt my jaw tighten slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. This wasn't about preference. It wasn't even about family, not in the way I had understood it. This was about control, about shaping an outcome over time. He pointed to a specific entry, a note referencing long-term asset continuity and the importance of maintaining a consistent public narrative. Public narrative. I almost laughed again. Of course there was a narrative. There always is. I thought about every dinner, every conversation where Daniel had been positioned as the future, the one who would carry things forward. It had felt natural at the time. It wasn't. It was constructed. I asked Gregory if my parents had written these notes. He said some of them. Others came from advisors, consultants, people brought in to help structure things properly. Properly. I let that word sit there for a second. I asked him if they had ever intended to tell me. He didn't hesitate this time. He said no. Simple, direct, no explanation, no justification. Just no. I nodded once, slowly. That was the last piece I needed. Not to understand what happened, to understand what this was. This wasn't favoritism that went too far. This wasn't a family dynamic that got out of balance. This was a strategy. Long-term, maintained over years, executed with consistency. And I had been the variable they managed. I felt something settle fully into place at that moment. The last bit of shock, gone. In its place, something much cleaner, clear, focused. I reached for the pen Gregory had placed on the desk earlier. He watched me, not surprised. He slid another document toward me. This one was different. Not history. Action. Confirmation of my role. Authorization to continue the process that had already begun. I read through it carefully. Every line. Every condition. Not because I didn't trust him. Because I needed to see it for myself. I needed to understand exactly what I was stepping into. There was no rush in my movements now. No hesitation either. Just deliberate action. When I finished reading, I picked up the pen again. My hand was steady. I signed my name, no flourish, no pause. Just a clean, controlled signature. Gregory took the document back and reviewed it briefly, then placed it into the folder with the same precision he had shown from the beginning. He said the process would continue automatically from this point. Of course it would. Everything about this had been designed to move without hesitation once it started. I sat back in the chair, my body finally relaxing just slightly, not from relief, but from alignment. Things made sense now, not in a comforting way, in a complete way. I thought about my dad again, about his voice on the phone, about how quickly he had shifted from anger to negotiation. I thought about my mom, about her careful tone, her attempt to reframe what had happened as something smaller than it was. I thought about Daniel, about how easily he had stepped into the role that had been built for him. None of it was accidental. None of it was spontaneous. It had all been moving in one direction for years. And now, for the first time, it had stopped. Or maybe not stopped, changed direction. I looked at Gregory. I asked him how long it would take before the next wave hit. He didn't check a watch. He didn't look at a calendar. He just said soon. I nodded. Then I reached for my phone again. The screen lit up immediately. More messages, more calls. The noise hadn't slowed down. If anything, it had sharpened. Less confusion now, more urgency. They were starting to understand that this wasn't a mistake. I placed the phone back on the desk without opening anything. For years, I had been reacting to their version of reality, adjusting, explaining, trying to find my place inside something that had never been built for me. I wasn't doing that anymore. Now, they were reacting, and I was the one holding the structure. I sat there for a moment longer, letting that settle, letting the weight of it distribute evenly instead of all at once. Then I looked back at Gregory and asked him what they were going to try next. He said they would try to contain it, not stop it, contain it. I almost smiled at that. That was exactly what they had always done. Frame it, control the edges, decide what was visible and what stayed out of reach. I stood up from the chair slowly, my coat still draped over the back. I said I understood. Then I asked him one more thing. I asked if anything in the trust prevented me from showing up in person. He looked at me for a second, measuring the question, not the words. Then he said no. There it was. I nodded once, picked up my coat, and slipped my phone into my bag. The noise on it didn't matter anymore. Not like this did. The drive back to Lincoln Park felt different than it had 3 nights earlier. Same streets, same turns. Different position. I wasn't arriving hoping to be included. I was arriving with something they couldn't ignore. When I pulled up in front of the house, there were already cars lining the street. Not as many as the dinner, but enough. That didn't surprise me. They were gathering. Of course they were. I stepped out of the car and closed the door with a quiet, controlled motion. No rush, no hesitation. The front door was unlocked. It always was when they wanted to appear open. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air felt heavier than it had before. Not warm this time. Tight. Voices filled the space, overlapping, tense. When I walked in, they stopped. Not gradually. All at once. Every conversation cut off mid-sentence. Every movement paused. For a second, no one spoke. I took that in. The same room. The same people. Different dynamic. My mom stood near the center of the room, her posture straight, her expression controlled in that familiar way she used when things weren't going according to plan. My dad was closer to the window, phone still in his hand, like he had been mid-call when I walked in. Daniel stood off to the side, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on me with a kind of intensity I hadn't seen before. No one smiled. No one pretended this was normal. That was new. My mom was the first to speak. Her voice was soft, careful. She said we needed to talk. I almost laughed. We had needed to talk for years. Now they wanted to. I stepped further into the room, my heels quiet against the floor, and set my bag down on the table near the entrance. I didn't sit. Neither did they. My dad spoke next. His tone was controlled, but there was an edge under it now. He said this had gone too far, that whatever I had triggered needed to be reversed immediately, that there were ways to handle things privately without creating unnecessary damage. Damage. Another interesting choice of word. I let him finish. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder Gregory had given me. The room shifted again, just slightly, not visibly, but I could feel it. Attention tightening. Focus narrowing. I walked over to the dining table, the same one we had sat at 3 nights ago, and placed the folder in the center. I didn't open it right away. I looked at them first. All of them. My parents. Daniel. A few extended relatives who had stayed. Watching. Waiting. I said one sentence. I said, "You didn't forget me. You erased me." The words landed clean. No raised voice. No emotion pushed into them. Just truth. For a second, no one responded. Then my mom shook her head slightly, her expression shifting into something softer, almost concerned. She said that wasn't what happened, that I was misunderstanding things, that emotions had been high at dinner and words had been taken out of context. There it was again. Context. I opened the folder. Slowly, deliberately. I turned it so it faced them, not me. I didn't explain. I let the documents do that. My dad stepped forward first, his eyes scanning the pages quickly, his expression tightening with each line. Daniel moved closer too, leaning slightly over the table, reading faster than my dad, his jaw setting in a way that told me he understood more than he wanted to admit. My mom didn't move right away. She stayed where she was, watching them instead of the documents. That told me everything I needed to know. She already knew. One of my aunts stepped closer, curiosity pulling her in despite herself. Then another. The room shifted again, people moving in, reading, whispering under their breath. The silence broke, not loudly, but in small, fractured pieces. What is this? This can't be right. When was this done? I stood there, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, watching them process something that had been real for years but invisible until now. My dad looked up at me. For the first time, there was no control in his expression, just calculation. He said these documents didn't mean what I thought they meant. That legal structures can be complex, that there were layers I didn't understand. I almost smiled. There it was. The same line repackaged. You don't understand how things work. I met his gaze. I said I understood exactly how this worked. Then I tapped the page in front of him, the one with the timeline, the one that showed every adjustment, every decision made without me. I said this wasn't complexity. This was consistency. He didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. Daniel straightened slightly, stepping back from the table. He looked at me, then at the documents again, like he was trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer matched. He asked when I had gotten this. I said it didn't matter when. It mattered that it existed. One of the older relatives, someone who had been quiet this whole time, stepped forward. He had always been observant. Quiet in a way that didn't draw attention but missed nothing. He looked at the documents, then at my parents. He said he had wondered about this before. The room stilled again, not as sharp as before. Heavier. He said things never quite added up, that certain decisions had always felt uneven. He didn't accuse, he didn't defend, he just stated it, and that was enough. My mom's expression changed then, just slightly. Not denial anymore. Adjustment. She stepped forward finally, closer to the table, closer to the documents. She said there were reasons for how things had been handled, that it had been necessary, that not everything could be explained at the time. Necessary. I let that word sit there. Then I asked her what exactly had been necessary about removing me from my own life. She didn't answer directly. She said they had been trying to protect something, to maintain stability, to ensure the right outcome. The right outcome. I felt that cold clarity settle deeper now, no longer sharp, just steady. I said the outcome they were trying to ensure didn't include me. She didn't deny that, not directly. My dad spoke again, stepping closer now, his voice lower, more controlled. He said this conversation didn't need to happen in front of everyone, that we could take this into another room, handle it properly. I looked around at the people gathered, at the faces that had watched me be dismissed 3 nights ago, at the same silence that had filled the room then. Then I looked back at him. I said this was the room where it started, so this was the room where it stayed. No one moved after that. No one suggested we go somewhere else. For the first time, the narrative they had built, the one that had held everything in place for years, wasn't just questioned, it was visible. And once something like that becomes visible, you can't put it back the way it was. I watched their faces, one by one, not rushing, not reacting, just observing the way I had learned to do over years of being in rooms where I didn't belong. That was the part no one ever noticed about me. They thought I was quiet, passive. I wasn't. I was paying attention. My dad reached for one of the pages again, flipping it over like if he moved fast enough it would become something else. Then he did something that should not have surprised me. He laughed. Not loud, not openly cruel, just a short, dismissive sound. He said documents can be arranged to say anything. That context matters. That people who don't understand structure can misread information and make it into something it's not. There it was again, not denial. Discrediting. And it wasn't aimed at the documents, it was aimed at me. I felt my hands rest more firmly against the table, grounding myself as I watched him try to rebuild control in real time. My mom stepped in then, smoother, more controlled. She moved closer to me, not to the documents. To me. That was always her method. She lowered her voice just enough to make it feel personal, even though everyone could still hear. She said I was overreacting, that I had always had a tendency to make things bigger than they were, that this was exactly why certain responsibilities had been given to Daniel instead. I didn't move. But something inside me shifted, just slightly. Not because of what she said, because of how easily she said it. Like this was a pattern she had rehearsed for years. She reached out, her hand brushing lightly against my arm, a gesture that would have looked comforting to anyone watching from a distance. I remembered that gesture. She used it when she needed to soften something ugly. She said we had always taken care of me, that I had never needed to worry about anything, that some people were meant to lead and some were meant to be supported. Supported. I almost laughed. I thought about every decision made without me, every opportunity redirected, every time I was told to stay out of conversations that would shape my own life. That wasn't support, that was containment. Then she said something that changed the room again. She said this arrangement had actually protected me, that if I had been more involved, if I had been placed in the position Daniel was in, I would have failed. The words didn't come out harsh. They came out calm, certain. That made them worse. I felt the air in the room shift, not in my favor, not in theirs, just heavier. People heard it, really heard it. For the first time, the mask slipped just enough for everyone to see what had always been underneath. I looked at her hands still resting on my arm, then I gently moved it away, not aggressively, just enough to break the illusion. And when I looked back at her, I didn't see my mom trying to fix something. I saw someone who had decided, a long time ago, exactly who I was allowed to be. I saw someone who had decided, a long time ago, exactly who I was allowed to be. And for the first time, I understood that nothing I said in that room was going to change her version of me. Not because she couldn't see it, because she had never wanted to. The room didn't explode after that. It didn't need to. It cracked. Slow, uneven fractures running through conversations, through glances, through the way people shifted their weight like they weren't sure where to stand anymore. No one defended me outright. But they didn't rush to defend my parents either. That was new. I gathered the documents calmly, sliding them back into the folder one page at a time. No rush, no hesitation. My dad watched me the entire time, his jaw tight, his eyes calculating something I couldn't quite see yet. Daniel had stepped back further now, almost near the edge of the room, like distance could give him space to think. No one stopped me when I picked up my bag. No one told me to stay. And I didn't ask. I walked out of that house the same way I had 3 nights ago. Except this time, I wasn't leaving empty-handed. The air outside felt colder than it should have been for that time of year. Or maybe it was just me. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, letting everything settle into place. Not emotionally, structurally, because that was what this was now, not a family conversation. A system shifting. By the time I got back to my apartment, the noise had already started. Messages, calls, the family splitting along lines I could have predicted years ago if I had been paying attention to the right things. I didn't read most of it. I already knew how people move when a structure shifts. Some toward safety, some toward whoever they think is still holding something. I set my phone face down on the counter and waited. Daniel knocked an hour later. I saw his name on my phone before I heard the knock. That was always Daniel. Predictable in a way that used to feel comforting. Now it just felt exposed. I didn't answer the call. I let it ring out, then set the phone down on the counter and walked to the door. He was standing there when I opened it, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly tense, like he wasn't sure how this conversation was going to go. For a second, we just looked at each other. No audience, no parents, no one else to shape the moment, just us. I stepped aside without saying anything. He walked in slowly, taking in the apartment like it was unfamiliar, even though he had been here before. That was the first thing I noticed. He didn't look comfortable, not like he used to. I closed the door behind him and leaned lightly against it, watching him move further inside. He didn't sit right away. He turned, facing me like he had rehearsed something on the way over and now wasn't sure how to start. He said my name quietly. I didn't respond, not because I was angry, because I didn't need to fill the silence for him anymore. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, then finally sat down at the edge of the couch. I stayed where I was. That distance mattered. He said things had gotten out of control. I almost smiled. That was the same word he had used on the phone. Control. I pushed off the door and walked over, stopping just far enough from him that we weren't sharing the same space. I asked him what exactly he thought was out of control. The truth, or the fact that people could see it now. He didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, fingers laced together like he was trying to hold something steady. Then he said he didn't know everything, that he had only been told certain things over the years, pieces, carefully selected ones. I watched him closely as he spoke, not the words, the pauses, the places where he hesitated. That was where the truth lived. I asked him what he had known, not what he had been told, what he had known. He shifted slightly, his shoulders tightening. Then he said he had always known there were differences in how decisions were made, in how responsibilities were assigned, and how I was included. He didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. I let that sit between us for a moment. Then I asked him why he had never said anything. That was the question that mattered, not what he knew, what he did with it. He looked up at me then, his expression something I hadn't seen before, not defensive, not dismissive, something closer to conflicted. He said it wasn't his place. I felt something inside me settle at that. Quiet. Clear. I asked him whose place he thought it was. He didn't answer. Because there wasn't one. That was the point. No one had ever claimed that space. Because claiming it would have meant changing something. And nothing in that house was ever meant to change. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now. He said things were complicated. That there were expectations, pressures. That he had been put in a position where certain decisions had already been made long before he understood them. I listened, really listened. Because part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to find something in his words that felt like it reached back toward me, but it didn't. It reached inward, toward himself, toward justification. I walked past him and sat down across from him, not next to him. That felt important. Facing him, not beside him. I said you benefited from it, not loud, not accusing, just factual. He flinched slightly at that, just enough. Then he said he hadn't asked for any of it. I nodded slowly. I believed that part. I said, but you didn't refuse it either. That was where the room shifted, not physically, emotionally, because that was the line he hadn't crossed in his own mind yet. Refusal. He sat back, his jaw tightening slightly, like he was trying to find a way around that without admitting it. He said things don't work like that, that you can't just step out of roles that have already been built around you. I held his gaze. I said I didn't step out. I was kept out. That landed differently. He looked away for a second, then back at me. And for the first time since he walked in, there was something honest in his expression. Not clean, not easy, but real. He said he had wondered sometimes if things had been different, if I had been given the same access, the same information. Would I have made different choices? Would things have turned out differently? I let that question sit between us. Then I answered it. I said we don't know. Because I was never given the chance. Silence settled again, not heavy this time, just final. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped again like he was trying to hold something together that was already slipping. Then he said something that changed everything just slightly. He said he had seen part of the documents before, not all of them, but enough to know there were discrepancies, enough to know something didn't line up. I felt that information settle into place slowly. I asked him when. He hesitated. Then he said a few years ago. Years. Not months. Not recently. Years. I nodded once, letting that sink in fully before I spoke again. I asked him what he had done with that. He didn't answer right away. Then he said he had been told it was being handled. Handled. I almost laughed. That word again. Always the same language. Always the same structure. I leaned back slightly, my hands resting loosely in my lap, and for the first time since he walked in, I felt something close to distance. Not anger, not hurt, something quieter. I said you knew enough to question it, and you chose not to. He shook his head slightly like he wanted to push back against that but didn't have the words to do it, because there weren't any. That was the truth of it. He didn't create the lie, but he lived inside it, and he let it stand. That mattered. More than anything he could say now. He looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was trying to find something familiar, something that still connected us to what we had been before, all of this surfaced. I held that gaze for a moment. Then I let it go. Because whatever that was, it didn't exist in the same way anymore. He stood up slowly, like the conversation had reached a point he couldn't move past. I didn't stop him. I didn't ask him to stay. He walked to the door, pausing for just a second with his hand on the handle. Then he said he didn't know how this was going to end. I stood where I was, watching him, and answered honestly. I said neither did I, but for the first time, it wouldn't be decided without me. He nodded once, like he understood that even if he didn't like it. He stood there with his hand on the handle for longer than he needed to, not hesitating, thinking. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the side table near the door. A key. Small. Brass. The kind that opens a lockbox, or a drawer, or something that had been kept shut for a long time. He didn't explain it. He didn't look back at me when he put it down. He just said there were things in the documents Gregory hadn't seen yet, that he had kept them separately, that he had told himself it was because they weren't relevant. He paused. Then he said he knew that wasn't why. I didn't move. I didn't ask him what was on the other side of it, because the key wasn't really information. It was a choice, made quietly, without an audience, without anyone to perform it for. That was the only version of accountability that meant anything. Then he opened the door and stepped out. The apartment fell quiet again after he left, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. This one felt settled. Gregory called just after 9 the next morning. I already knew what the call was going to be before I answered. He said there were 2 paths forward. Full disclosure, everything documented, everything public, formal and irreversible. Or controlled execution, the trust enforced, the structure corrected, nothing expanded beyond what was necessary. I asked him what my grandmother had intended, not in legal terms, in outcome. He said she had built it to correct imbalance, not to punish. That distinction mattered, more than anything else he said. I told him we proceed with controlled execution. He nodded once through the phone. I could hear it in the pause before he spoke again. He said once this moves forward, it doesn't reverse. I already knew that. I signed the documents that afternoon, my name settling into place on the page like it had always been meant to be there, not added. Restored. Restored. When I stood up to leave, I felt something different than I had walking into that office. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Something steadier. Like I had finally stepped into something that had been waiting for me. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner somehow. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the city move around me, people passing, conversations blending into the background, life continuing like nothing had shifted. But it had. Quietly. Completely. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the messages that were still coming in, the questions, the assumptions, the attempts to understand something none of them had the full picture of. I didn't respond to any of them. Not yet. Because this wasn't about explaining. It was about letting the truth take its place, without noise, without permission, just there. I agreed to meet, not at the house, not in any space that belonged to them. We met in a quiet office Gregory had arranged, neutral, intentional. When I walked in, they were already there. My dad was standing near the window, his posture still straight, but there was something missing in the way he held himself. My mom seated at the table, hands folded, her expression composed, but tighter than I had ever seen it. Daniel sat off to the side, not quite part of the center anymore. That detail didn't escape me. No one spoke right away. For a moment, we just existed in the same room again, but it wasn't the same room, and we weren't the same people. My dad spoke first. He said this had gone far enough, that whatever point I had been trying to make had been made. That we needed to find a way to move forward without further damage. Damage, still that word. I sat down across from them, my hands resting lightly on the table, my posture relaxed, not defensive. I said the damage had already been done. We were just seeing it now. He didn't respond immediately. My mom leaned forward slightly then, her voice softer than his. Careful. Measured. She said we could fix this, that things had gotten out of hand, but they didn't have to stay that way. That we could go back to how things were. There it was. Not an apology, not acknowledgement, a reset. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment I saw exactly what she was offering. not reconciliation. Containment. A return to a version of reality where everything could be placed back into its assigned position, where I would step back into the space they had defined for me. Smaller, manageable, silent. I shook my head slowly. Not harsh, not emotional. Just clear. I said we couldn't go back. She held my gaze, her expression tightening just slightly. She said we had to, that this wasn't just about us, that there were people depending on the structure we had built, that dismantling it would affect more than just the family. There it was again, responsibility, framed as obligation, used as pressure. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my voice steady. I said I wasn't dismantling anything. I was letting it stand where it actually belonged. Without me holding it in place, that landed, not loudly. But it shifted something. Daniel spoke then, his voice quieter than before. He said things didn't have to end like this. I looked at him, and for a moment I saw the version of him I had grown up with. Not the role he had been given, the person underneath it. But that wasn't enough, not anymore. I said this wasn't ending, it was changing. And change doesn't ask permission. My dad's jaw tightened slightly, his patience thinning. He said I was making a mistake, that I was isolating myself from the only support system I had ever had. I almost smiled at that. Support. I said I had never actually had that system. Not in the way he meant. There was silence again. He didn't argue with that. He couldn't, because this wasn't about perspective anymore. It was about proof. My mom reached across the table slightly then, not touching me this time, just closing the distance enough to make it feel intentional. She said we were still family, that nothing could change that. I let that sit for a moment. Then I answered honestly. I said family isn't something you say, it's something you do. And what you did made it very clear where I stood. Her hand stilled on the table, not pulled back, not moving forward, just there. I stood up slowly, the movement calm, controlled, not abrupt, not final, just a step. I said I would continue in my role as executor, that I would ensure everything moved according to what had been set in place long before any of us were sitting in this room. But I wouldn't be stepping back into the system they had built, not as a participant, not as a placeholder, not as anything less than what was already mine. My dad didn't stop me as I picked up my bag. My mom didn't call after me. Daniel didn't say anything. That silence followed me all the way to the door, but this time it didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like confirmation. Outside, the air felt different again, not sharper, not colder, just open. I walked to my car, my phone buzzing again in my bag. Calls I already knew I wasn't going to answer. Not because I was avoiding them, because I didn't need to go back into conversations that no longer had anything to offer me. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the wheel, the city stretching out in front of me in a way that felt wider than it had before. For the first time, I wasn't trying to find where I fit inside something that had already decided my place. I was choosing where I stood, and that felt different in a way I didn't have words for yet. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, looking at the screen one last time before setting it down. The messages, the missed calls, the noise. One name stood out from the rest. Not family. Not someone trying to pull me back into a room I had already left. Caroline. She had called twice, back to back, no voicemail. That told me everything about what she wanted to say. I didn't answer. But I didn't scroll past it either. I sat with her name on the screen for a moment, thinking about what she had said when she came to my apartment. There are people watching this now, not just within the family, outside it. People who would decide where they stood based on how this unfolded. She had framed it as information then. Now she was calling. That was its own kind of answer. The people she had been talking about, the ones watching, the ones waiting to see which way this settled, they had seen enough. And Caroline, who never moved without calculating the distance first, had picked up the phone. Not to warn me, to position herself. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat, not because I was avoiding her, because I didn't need to hear it to know what it meant. The outside had already decided. I sat there longer than I needed to, the engine still off. The street quiet in that particular way. Chicago gets just before the city fully wakes up, not silent, just paused. Like everything is holding its breath before the next thing begins. I had been in this car before, in this exact stillness, the night this all started. Sitting in front of their house with my hands on the wheel, staring at nothing, not yet understanding what I was holding. That felt like a different person now. Not because I had changed in any dramatic way, not because I had won something, or proven something, or arrived somewhere I had been trying to reach, but because the question had changed. For most of my life, the question I was trying to answer was, why don't I fit? I spent years turning that question over, adjusting myself around the edges of it, making myself smaller, quieter, more careful, as if the right combination of effort and patience would eventually close the distance between who I was and who they needed me to be. It never did. Because the question was wrong. The real question was never why I didn't fit. It was why I kept trying to fit into something that had been deliberately built without me. Those are not the same question. And the difference between them is the difference between a decade of self-doubt and a single afternoon in a lawyer's office where everything finally made sense. Someone told me once, a woman I worked with years ago, someone I hadn't thought about in a long time, that the most exhausting thing a person can do is perform belonging they don't feel. I remember nodding when she said it. I didn't understand it then, not really. I thought she was talking about social anxiety, about introversion, about the small discomforts of being in rooms where you don't know anyone. I understand it now. Performing belonging in your own family is a different kind of exhaustion. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like performance because you've been doing it so long, it just feels like being alive, like breathing, like the normal cost of existing in close proximity to people who are supposed to love you. You don't notice how much it takes until you stop. And then you feel it, that specific weight lifting the one you forgot was there, because you had been carrying it since you were 10 years old and started learning not to interrupt, not to expect, not to want things that weren't going to be offered. I also realized something that took me longer to name. My grandmother didn't rescue me. I had been thinking about what she did as a kind of rescue, a hand reaching across time, a safety net she had built in secret, a way of saying, I saw you, even when they didn't. But that wasn't it. She wasn't rescuing me. She was returning something that had always been mine. There's a difference. Rescue implies you were helpless. Implies someone else's action is what determined your outcome. What she gave me wasn't salvation. It was information, and a structure, and a condition that would only activate if I needed it, which meant she also believed, until the end, that I might not. She hoped I wouldn't need it, but she made sure I would have it if I did. That's not rescue. That's the kind of love that trusts you to handle the truth when you're ready for it. That doesn't protect you from hard things. It makes sure hard things can't be used to erase you. I sat with that for a long moment. The morning light was shifting outside, coming in at a lower angle now, catching the edge of the windshield in a way that made everything look briefly gold. She used to do that. Notice light. She would stop mid-sentence sometimes just to watch the way afternoon came through a window, and then she'd keep talking like nothing had happened. I used to think it was just an old woman's habit. Now I think she was paying attention to things the rest of them had stopped seeing. I started the engine eventually. Not because I had somewhere to be, not because someone was waiting, not because the next thing on the list had announced itself and demanded I move, just because I wanted to. I drove north, away from their neighborhood, away from the office building where I had signed my name back into my own life, away from all of it. I ended up near the lake. I don't know if I chose it consciously. Maybe I just drove until the city opened up and there was water and space and the particular quality of silence that only exists next to something larger than you. I parked and sat there for a while, not thinking about next steps, not running through what came next legally, structurally, practically. Gregory would call. There would be more documents, more decisions. The process would continue doing what it had been designed to do. That could wait. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I let the next thing wait. The water was flat and gray and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened. The city behind me was already moving, already generating noise, already producing the next version of itself without pausing to acknowledge anything. I found that steadying, not because it diminished what had happened, because it didn't. The world kept moving, and I was still here, still intact, still the same person who had walked into a room full of family and been told she didn't belong. Except now I understood that their ability to say that had never been the same as it being true. They had confused authority with accuracy for a very long time. So had I. That was the thing I hadn't expected to feel at the end of this. Not anger, not relief, not the satisfaction of having proven something, just the quiet, steady recognition that I had been real the entire time. Even when no one in that room was willing to confirm it, even when the silence after my mother's words had filled the space where I used to exist, I had been real, and now the record reflects that. It was all still there. But it didn't hold me anymore, because belonging isn't something someone gives you. It's something you claim, quietly, completely. And sometimes, the only way to claim it is to walk away from the place that never truly saw you.